Everyone, glad you guys could be here as we start a new book. We have just been talking about James, the letter that St. James authored or at least dictated to the Jewish Christians living throughout the diaspora. And now we're switching our focus over here to the two universal letters of Saint Peter. So Saint Peter wrote two letters. The authorship is not really in doubt like it was when we were talking about James. We're like, there are five different Jameses. Which James are we talking about here? With Peter, we're pretty sure that this was Saint Peter writing this, or at least this came from the source of Saint Peter. We'll talk about maybe who wrote it. But before we get into that, let's offer our prayer, and then we'll talk a little bit about the background information, and then dive into chapter 1. Get your little prayer cards. Here we go. Let us pray the Lord. Lord, have mercy. Shine within my heart, loving Master, the pure light of your divine knowledge, and open the eyes of my mind that I may understand your teachings. Instill in me also a reverence for your blessed commandments, so that having conquered sinful desires, I may pursue a spiritual way of life, thinking and doing all those things that are pleasing to you. For you, Christ my God, are my light, and to you I give glory, together with your Father and your Holy Spirit, now and forever. Amen. All right. Glad you guys could be here with us. We've got a lot to get through. If you need, come on in. Come on in. We just said the prayer, so you're right on time. You're right on time. Perfect. We've got a lot to talk about today. I was looking ahead at our calendar. We have 8 chapters between the two letters of Peter, and we don't quite have 8 whole weeks. When you think of like Thanksgiving, when you think of like Christmas Eve is a Wednesday, I think, isn't it? I think it is something like that. Something like that. So like we're gonna run out of weeks if we do the intro and then chapter 1 separate. So yeah, so we're gonna do the intro to Peter and First Peter chapter 1 today, and we might have to double up someplace later in the week or later weeks. All right. So this is what's known as a universal or Catholic epistle, right? So it's to the entire church. That means two things. One, it was addressed to a wider audience, right? Paul writing to the Church of Corinth, he's writing to one set people. When he's writing to the Romans, he's writing to one set people. When we've got this letter, and even, I mean, really, even James, he's writing to the Jewish Christians that are scattered throughout the world. So, but they would still consider Jerusalem their home, you know? So this is now a letter that's going out, and we're going to see it, the first one for sure. This is a letter going out to all Gentile Christians everywhere, right? Everywhere. So this is what's known as a Catholic or universal letter because it's not intended for one set audience. It's intended for a grand, wide audience. It's also called a Catholic or universal letter because it was universally accepted as being like a letter with authority, right? We have lots of letters, more so than just the letters that are in the New Testament. We have lots of letters that still exist from that time period. We have letters from Polycarp. We have letters from Ignatius. Both of them wrote many letters. We have the letter of Clement of Rome writing to Corinth. We have the letter of Barnabas, right? And a lot of people talk about the epistle of Barnabas. So there are lots of different things that we have still today, but they weren't included in the scripture because they weren't universally accepted as being like letters with authority. These weren't people speaking from a position of like ownership of the church, as like an instruction that would have benefited all Christians. They were writing correspondence.
We do have more gospel
For sure. Yeah. But yeah, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, it was universally accepted that these 4 books are the definitive gospel accounts, right? And that any others are fine. I mean, you can read them, but they're not to be held in the same kind of category. Yeah, sure.
How are the letters delivered and what time frame?
Okay, we're going to talk about that. So you'll see here, we'll talk about that here in a second. Because obviously you couldn't get on a Zoom call, with everyone, right? You couldn't, so they would make multiple copies. They'd send them out to different locations. When you're talking about, Paul writing to the Philippians, he's sending one person with the one letter to read in the synagogue or in the church in Philippi. But with these universal letters, these would have had to make the rounds, right? Or there'd be multiple copies. Most likely you'll hear here, or you'll see here, that Peter lists a number of places: the Galatians, the Cappadocians, the Asians, the Bithynians, right? So it's most likely, and they were all locations that centered, or like in Asia Minor. So it's very possible that those were kind of day trips. Not, it took longer than a day to get there, but they'd spend a day or two in that area reading and preaching this letter, and then go out on the next stop. Yeah. Yeah, by hand and orally, for sure.
Say not everybody could read.
No, no way. No one could read. No one could read. That was a very unique skill until we have the printing press, millennia later. Like, yeah, for sure. All right. So this is a universal or Catholic epistle. Generally speaking, you'll see that this letter, in both of them, but especially First Peter, were offered from like a pastoral perspective, right? James, that we just finished reading, was kind of like a moral exhortation, like be better, like don't be a harlot, don't be a false teacher, right? It was kind of like a spurring on to like morality. This is very different, and you'll see the content is extremely different in this letter. So this was largely from the perspective of Peter, trying to comfort these new Christians that were living in Gentile lands, that had been experiencing hardship and were about to experience worse hardship. Okay, we're going to talk about that. He also speaks heavily in this letter specifically about the second coming. So he talks about and James hinted at that in his. We talked about the parousia, the like apocalypse, right? The epiphania. We talked about that. But he specifically used the word parousia. Peter is going to talk a little bit about the second coming as well. Remember, they thought it was imminent. They thought it was coming back. They thought Christ was coming in their earthly lifetimes. So it was something that was on the forefront of their mind. And Peter is saying here that you've got to be steadfast in your faith. Let's not be disobedient to what Christ left us with, because he's going to come and ask account of what we've done, right? So we're going to see that, right? And he said that if you do that, you will gain. If you have that perspective of the second coming, that'll be the thing that'll motivate you and empower you during these hardships that you're about to have. Like, it's almost over, kind of thing, right? Keep going, push through a little bit longer. He's just a minute away, So that was kind of the perspective. That was the lens that he was kind of writing in. Interesting note: this letter was written before we saw a whole lot of structure in the church. He mentions nothing about deacons. He mentions nothing about bishops in this letter at all. And we see it in Acts, but we don't see it here in this letter. So, we know from Polycarp's letters and Ignatius's letters in the early second century, we see that they are mentioning bishops and deacons. So someplace at that turn of the century, we had like ordained clergy that were being recognized for their purposes, as opposed to kind of ambiguous elders. Well, in this letter, Peter calls himself an elder, right? So he's not calling himself necessarily a bishop, like the Bishop of Rome, right? Or the Bishop of Antioch, like he was. So he's using like early words and terminology in his letter here. He also, interestingly enough, in chapter 5, as he's closing this first letter, he says that this letter is written through Silvanus, via Silvanu, right? Silas, right? Silvanus was like the Jonathan, and Silas would be like Johnny. Like it was like the nickname and proper name. So Silvanus and Silas were probably the same person. And we know Silas quite a bit from his appearance in the book of Acts, chapter 15 and 16, and from all of the places that he's mentioned in all of Paul's epistles, because he went with Paul through his entire second missionary trip. Paul's entire remember when the whole fallout with Mark happened? We talked about this last year when we were studying the book of Acts. Mark abandoned Paul during that first trip. And so much so that it got him so upset that he was like, "No, I'm not taking him again." And he told Barnabas, I'm not touching this guy again," which is his brother, or his cousin. He was like, "I'm not touching this guy again." And so he was like, "Well, I'll take Silas, you take Mark, because I'm not dealing with his nonsense." Thank God Mark ended up redeeming himself and becoming a great comfort to Paul, and a great herald in himself, going to Alexandria and being a bishop there. But so Silas is probably the person who's writing this letter while Peter is dictating, right? So it's probably by Silas's hand, and he even confesses it. He says it in the last chapter. I am writing this through Silas, through Silvanus, right? A little bit more on Silas. Silvanus was a very important person in the early church, a huge important person. We met him, like we said, in chapter 15 of the book of Acts. He was a leading figure of the church. He was a prophet. We hear that in Acts 15:32. He was one of the leading brothers of the Council of Jerusalem that Peter presided over, right? When they were talking about, do Gentiles have to be circumcised in order to become Christians, like we were as Jews, or can we just have them come in? And so that council he presided over. Well, Silas was there. Silvanus was there. He was one of the brothers that was part of that council. We know that he was, like we said, Paul's travel companion, travel partner on his second missionary journey. And he accompanied him to Philippi and Corinth on their first visits. So he was there to see the birth of the churches there. And lastly, and maybe most importantly, Silas, was a Roman citizen. Peter is not. Paul was. So, I mean, Paul and Silas could go anywhere in the Roman Empire. They had currency. They knew the cultural norms. They were protected by certain like liberties, like they couldn't be crucified, right? They couldn't be arrested without proper cause and without a trial, like a fair trial. So they had a little bit more confidence traveling. Well, if Peter is looking to make his way around some of the churches in kind of Gentile areas, in Roman provinces, Roman areas, if he's writing to the Christians in these Roman territories, it would behoove him to have a Roman citizen by his side, kind of like as his, not as his guide, but as his like street cred, right? Keep in mind, Peter, albeit filled with the Holy Spirit, right? He got the tongue of fire during Pentecost, and he preached in all of those languages. He was a simple fisherman. So his language skills weren't classically trained. Silas's probably were, being a Roman citizen and raised in Roman academia. He would have known how to write and read classical Greek, right? And the Greek in this text is pretty sophisticated. Much more so than what you would expect from a Galilean fisherman, right? Jewish, Aramaic speaking fisherman. Again, the Holy Spirit can strengthen everything and perfect all that which is lacking. So who knows if Peter had given that grace on Pentecost and if it translated to like his reading and writing skills. But it's reasonable to suggest that Silas would have been his penman, right?
So was he Jewish?
Peter was.
No, Peter, I knew.
Silas? Silas, I'm gonna have to, probably not. Silas wasn't a Jewish name, So he was probably just a Roman living in the area at the time. But he became a Christian immediately. He was like from day one, he's there. He's with the apostles, and he's part of the broader band of 70, So he was there from the inception of Christ's ministry, but most likely as a Gentile. Yeah. All right. Let's see here. So having said Gentiles, right? This was most likely a letter to the Gentiles, right? All of the places that he named here weren't super populated with Jews. These were Roman territories. You can also see in here that he mentions nothing about the law. James talked exclusively about the law in those like what chapter 2 and 3. Like that's all he talked about was the law of liberty, the royal law, right? So James is talking about morality and living according to the law, not just the Mosaic law, but the law that Christ gave us of loving God and loving your neighbor. Peter doesn't talk about the law at all. No, so no talking about the law, which shows that he's probably not writing to a Jewish audience because that would have been the thing to grab their attention, like James knew. So we're looking at the preacher to the Jewish Christians and Paul obviously, but the preacher to the apostle to the Gentiles, right? Okay, so he's writing largely to the Gentiles. He's also talking about their previous physical passions. That wouldn't have been a Jewish problem. The Jews lived moral lives, right? They might have been, greedy or, apathetic or hardened in their hearts, or what they might have had a slew of sins, right, that they were guilty of. It was the Gentiles that had the immorality, the kind of sexual lusts and the debauchery and the drunkenness. So talking about that, insinuating that like previous immorality, he's not talking to a Jewish audience here. That would have been kind of irrelevant, off base. So this letter was meant to go to Christians who were coming from the nations, not from Israel. Okay. Peter, finally, if that wasn't enough proof to this, Peter also uses his Greek name in this. He doesn't call himself Simon, which was his birth name, right? And he doesn't call himself Cephas, right? He calls himself Petros. He calls himself Peter. So he's using his Greek name for Greek people, right?
Jesus.
Yeah, Jesus named him in Hebrew Cephas and in Greek Petros, right? Which means the rock. Yeah. So he didn't use his Jewish names, or his Hebrew names. He used his Greek name here. All right. All right. So he's a pastor writing to the church out of compassion for them and interest in trying to empower them during their troubles and the upcoming troubles. What were these troubles? These troubles were legit. They were bad. Okay. It was Roman persecution dialed up to 11. This was awful. All right. Early on, though, the Romans didn't care. They couldn't care less about Christians, and they left them alone. Early on, the Romans couldn't distinguish if you were a Jew or if you were a Christian. They looked the same. The practices were the same, right? So they didn't get involved with that. They thought it was a nuance, like you're a Pharisee, you're a Sadducee, you're a Christian. Okay, like whatever. Go be about your business, right? What changed? And actually, there was they had this idea. They were kind of advanced for their society. Even though they were polytheists, right? They had their, all of their pagan gods. They let the Jews practice their faith. They never made them become idols themselves or idolaters themselves. They respected that. They called it the religio licita, right? The free religion. You can do this one without any kind of penalty from Rome, right? So this was one of the approved religions of the Roman Empire because they weren't going to cross the Jews. That was fine. You go about your business. That's fine. And so they lumped Christianity into that until they didn't, right? Until the Jews started saying, hey, don't link us with them. These guys are troublemakers. And they started like trying to split hairs, right? And say, no, we're not. Well, that's not splitting hairs. There's a big hair that we're splitting. Christ is a big deal, right? So they started saying, no, these aren't us. You have to take closer attention here because they're causing us trouble. And if they cause us trouble, it's going to cause you trouble, right? That's all fine. And most of that wasn't even really that compelling. What changed was a man named Nero, which was the worst. So Nero, the Roman emperor, the Roman Caesar, he was just crazy and sadistic and evil in like all the sense of the word. So he had a love for building, right? And because of that, he wanted to refashion Rome according to like what he saw fit. So on July 19th, 64 AD, he burned Rome, lots of it, right? And while some people still suggest, like, oh, maybe Nero didn't start the fire, whatever, it's clear that he wasn't upset about it, right? He looked at it from his tower, and he even remarked at how beautiful and dazzling the flames looked. He was happy about that, right? He was happy that the city was burning, and Rome was very congested, and most of the structures were built out of wood, so it just went up like a tinderbox. It raged for 3 days, and then it subsided, and then it started again. How did it start again? Well, there are many people, many of the ancient historians, and again, lots of people who saw this happening, where they saw Roman centurions, Roman soldiers, kindling fire again and starting fire and keeping them going. People who tried to stop things from burning were detained. So there was, even if Nero himself didn't order the fire to start, he was not one bit displeased that it was happening, right? In that fire, lots of people lost their lives, lots of people lost their homes, but also there were 4 major pagan temples that were destroyed in the fire. And the people were irate, right? And they saw this as not only like an act of God or a terrible tragedy where they are now displaced. They saw like we see with the hurricanes and things like that, right? They were angered because it looked like terrorism, and they were upset that somebody attacked their faith. Nero is catching all this heat now, all of it, right? And to deflect that, he says, okay, well, I need a scapegoat. Enter the Christians, right? The Christians made the perfect scapegoat because we know that they don't worship in idol temples, right? We know that the Jews already don't like them, so they're not going to get upset one bit that we're pinning this on them. And there's a lot of skepticism around these early Christians. We don't know much about them, right? They've kept to themselves. They've only been around for 3 decades. And what we do here is that when they worship, after they're done worshiping, they have what's called the agape meal, the love feast, right? What is that? Is that some kind of like insidious, dark kind of sexual thing, right? It must be, right? It must be. And when they are worshiping, what are they doing? They're eating some guy's flesh and drinking his blood, right? So now they're cannibals. So Nero has this whole idea. He goes, half of my empire wants them out anyway because they're Jews. The other half are mad and looking for someone to blame these devastating fires in Rome, and I can't take the fall myself. Well, there's already this like kind of rampant distrust and like skepticism around these people, and like honestly fear around these people who are calling themselves Christian. Let's pin it on them. And they do. Once that happens, it's like run for your lives if you're a Christian. It becomes terrible. It becomes awful. And he leads the way, right? He would the evil things that they would do to the Christians are almost unspeakable. They are unspeakable. He would like sew them in animal skins, like he would sew animal skins on them and have his hunting dogs chase them and eat them, right? And he would bind them, roll them in tar and pitch, and put them on pyres, on sticks, and light them to light his garden, right? It's awful. Peter is going to write in this letter, and he's going to talk about like these persecutions. It's probably likely that he's talking about these very things that Nero is doing with some of the terminology. You'll see it when we get into it. He's going to start talking about things that say like, wow, I wonder if he means the great fire in Rome. I wonder if he means the burning of Christians, right? So these are the things that are happening in Rome and are coming to the rest of the empire, right? So if he's writing to the people in Asia, the Roman provinces in Asia, he's saying, watch out. There's something that's brewing and it's not good. But be strong in your faith because God's going to be there with you. All right. It's disgusting, right? All right. So like we said, Peter calls himself an elder. He doesn't call himself, like a bishop or anything like that. He does talk about being an eyewitness to Christ's sufferings. That's not inappropriate to say, even though we obviously know he wasn't there for his crucifixion, right? He denied Christ 3 times and left, and it was only John and the mother and the myrrh-bearing women that were with Christ at Golgotha. But he was there to see his arrest. He was there to see the beatings and spittings and scourgings and all that, because it says as Jesus is arrested and being like beaten, he looks at him as the rooster crows the third time. So like Peter was probably there up until the judgment, right? He just couldn't take it anymore and fled and wept, so he was there to see the sufferings, even if he didn't see the crucifixion. That's not inaccurate. And then you could also argue that he saw him suffer during those 3 years of, being ridiculed and mocked by the people that he loved, right? So that's not an inconsistency that we need to be worried about, right? This letter, especially the first one, First Peter, may actually be two letters in one. The initial address and closing salutations are not part of the original letter. So these opening, what, 3 verses, 2 verses? 2 verses. The first 2 verses were not part of the original letter, right? So it's probably, something that the deliverer, put on there, or was added, for context. And at First Peter chapter 4, verse 11, there's a doxology. It like breaks, like the content kind of breaks and pauses to offer this like praise on verse 11 of chapter 4. In the writing of the time, the norms at the time, you would put in a doxology for sure, but not in the middle. You would put that at the end to be like, all right, now that we're done speaking, let's stand and offer a closing prayer kind of thing. So having said that, seeing it in chapter 4, verse 11, probably suggests that was the end of one letter, and that the second letter, which was a shorter one, was just added on separately, and the two were compiled together. That was not an uncanon practice, like you were saying. How did these letters get around? Well, by foot. If I'm going all the way to Asia, right, and you've got a second letter that's ready to go, I'm like, give me that one too. All right, I'm going to take both of these at the same time, right? So that's nothing crazy. It probably was. What we could see here is that if that was the case, this first letter that ends in chapter 4 might have been a sermon at someone's baptism. You're going to see that throughout. You'll see that in the next 3 weeks here. And then the second part might have been that pastoral letter to get people ready for this persecution. Maybe he was writing it right after the baptism was the first part early on in the church before there was, bishops and deacons. And maybe the second letter was right after the fire in 64 and saying, no, hold on, you got to get ready. Like, put this with that. Take it now. They need to know what's about to happen, This letter, even though it's kind of like necessitated by what's happening in Rome, wasn't written in Rome, right? Peter and Paul, for that matter, didn't actually make it to Rome until they were arrested and ready to be martyred, right? Neither of them ever went there as a free man, okay? So this was not written in Rome. This was written most likely in Asia for the people of Asia, right? Saint Polycarp is the first writer to extensively quote Peter. Well, he was the Bishop of Smyrna, which is in Western Turkey, right? We watched that movie 2 years ago about that. So an Asian bishop is the one that's quoting him most frequently and earliest, right? So it was probably one of their local treasures that they had. His style in these letters are also very close to Paul's style in his letter to the Ephesians. There are a bunch of similarities to First Peter and Ephesians. There's a ton of similarities. So those two letters were probably being circulated in the same areas. One of them certainly inspired the other one, or certain events inspired both of them at the same time, right? Because they were saying very similar things in both those letters, almost like carbon copies of each other. And this letter also has a lot of similarities to John's writings, both his universal letters and his gospel and the book of Revelation. Well, where did he write? Not Revelation, sorry, I got carried away. But his letters and his gospel, where did he write those from? From Asia Minor, from Ephesus, right? So there's a chance all of these point to this letter being written in this same location because it's so similar to all of these other things that were penned in Ephesus, right? Which is the westernmost part of Turkey, of Asia Minor, that was on the river that fed all of the other places on the interior, right? So all of the places that he's saying to go to, Galatia, Cappadocia, all of these places, those were downriver from where he was in Ephesus, which would have made sense. Write it, send it down that way, right? And travel, Okay. Ultimately, Peter's letters were written to the Gentile believers in response to the intense persecution following the Great Fire of Rome. These letters were meant to encourage the Christians of Asia Minor to stand fast when the onrushing attacks of the Romans were about to engulf them. Okay? Having said that, ready? Chapter 1. If you've got the Orthodox Study Bible, we're on page 1683. Chapter 1, we're going to go verses 1 and 2, and we did that fine. That was only 30 minutes. Here we go. Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to the pilgrims of the dispersion in Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia, elect according to the foreknowledge of God the Father in sanctification of the Spirit for obedience in the sprinkling of the blood of Jesus Christ. Grace to you and peace be multiplied. Okay, let's talk about that. There is no greater compliment in the world than being God's chosen, right? So he says, to the pilgrims in dispersion, right? The elect according to the foreknowledge of God, right? The eklektos is that word. That's the word. Eklektos it wasn't like you were the randomly like selected one, right? The lottery was yours. This is you were chosen from others, right? By hand. You were the hand-picked one, right? That's what this really means. It means a deeply personal choice. That's what the definition, the biblical dictionary says. It was a deeply personal choice, literally chosen out of personal preference. Okay. This could range from anything like fruit at a market, right? Where you pick up the apple and you look at it before you put it back. And there are thousands of them here. And I'm going to choose these 5 because these are the ones that look pleasing, right? I'm going to snack on the one grape to make sure that this one's good and not the rest of them. Anyone who doesn't snack on a grape before buying a big bag of grapes is doing it wrong. And my wife won't. Presbytero won't. Presbytero won't. And she gets mad at me because I'm the priest snacking on the grapes. I'm like, no, that bag's no good. That bag's no good. She's like, you got to stop this. You gotta stop. I was like, they're not gonna arrest me, and we're gonna buy it. If it's good, I'm gonna buy it. But my wife says, she's like, that's your papu right there. That's my papu. She's like, don't do that. Don't do that. I'm like, it's reckless not to. So anyway, the point is like, that's what chosen means. The one that I've picked, and I see that that one is better than everyone else, that's the one that's coming home to feed my kids, right? It could also mean, so like that's the most mundane of the definitions or applications for this word. The greatest application is, here's the army, you 100 are going to be the royal guard, right? You're going to be the centurions that live in the palace, right? I'm going to hand pick my protectors for the king, okay? So this is a great word that he's using. You are the chosen. You are the handpicked by God. Okay? We are chosen from the rest of the world. When Jews settled in a new town, they still never took their eyes off of Jerusalem. That's why they always pointed their synagogues towards Jerusalem. That's why we always face east, not because we're pointing to any kind of earthly city, but to the kingdom that's going to come, hopefully at the next sunrise, right? Where it's the dawn the sun will dawn over the new kingdom of God. So we're always facing east, living in this one area, but with our eyes fixed to the kingdom to come, right? Well, that's what he's talking about, the dispersion, right? All of you who are living across the Roman, empire, I greet you, right? You are the ones who are elect, right? The word in Greek for such a resident like living in a kind of a Gentile land, right, is parepidimos. Literally someone passing through. Para means next to, and epidemio, excuse me, is like the common people of the city, like demo, like demographic, right? That's where that word comes from. So the people who are living next to, the people of the city, but the city that they're living in is not their home. It's next to, right? It's like para. It's not the actual. It's not aftos, right? It's not aftos epidemio, right? It's the parepidemos, right? So Christians can see all of life in this context, right? Whatever comes to us throughout the day, any day of the week, we view it in the lens of eternity, right? Oh, this was a really terrible day, but you know what? The kingdom's waiting for me, right? Or this was a great day, but it's going to get better, right? So we always view life with our eyes to eternity. So we're always this like resident, like demographic in the city next to where we want to be, right? Um, we inhabit lands of our births, and but we live there as temporary residents. We do our civic duties, but we also experience the same kind of alienation and hardships as a foreigner, right? Or a refugee. We pass our days on earth, but our citizenship is in heaven. And now he says, may it be granted to us, right? Here we go. So he says, this foreknowledge of God in verse 2, this foreknowledge of God, the Father, and sanctification of the Spirit for the obedience and sprinkling of the blood of Christ. Saint Basil the Great writes about this, saying, may it be granted to us, after we have struggled nobly and subdued the spirit of the flesh, which was at enmity with God, when our soul is in calm and tranquil state, to be called children of peace and share the blessings of God in peace in our true homeland, right? So he's saying, if we can subdue our spirit that's always combating God's will, then we will become residents of his home, his kingdom, right? The church is not just a physical location or even a human organization. Its origin lies not in the ideals of men or in human aspirations or plan, but in the eternal purpose of God, the foreknowledge. This church was built by God's design, even though we're the ones who designed it with architecture and furnishings and priests. No. It's God's design, right? So all of this, I might be the leader of the apostles, but I'm not the leader of the church. God is, that's what Peter's saying. Now we are chosen. Why are we chosen? For what purpose? To be obedient to God. That's what he's saying. We are chosen. We are the elect to be obedient to the Father. Well, and to be sprinkled by the blood of Christ. Okay, where does that happen? That's happened 3 times in the Old Testament, right? In Leviticus chapter 14, verse 1 through 7, when a leper was healed, when a leper would be healed, the rule book of the Jews said that he was to be sprinkled by the blood of a bird, symbolizing and confirming his cleansing, right? So the miracle wasn't enough. They had to do this ritual after the fact. Anyway, we're not going to talk about that. But so that was the first one. Exodus, so I guess that was the last one, right? Because the next 2 are from Exodus. But Exodus chapter 29, verses 20 through 21, it describes how Aaron and the other priests were selected by the sprinkling of the blood, right? For their duties. They were sprinkled by the blood of an animal to show that these were going to be the priests that would then offer the future sacrifices, right? So it was to show that a leper had been healed, that a priest had been ordained and called to service. And then the final one was to the sign of Israel's covenant with God, right? Obedience was necessary for this new relationship with God. So Moses, when he had gotten the commandments, right, in Exodus chapter 24, verse 1 through 8, he took half of the blood from the sacrifice and sprinkled the altar, and the other half he sprinkled the people, right? So this is the altar that God has given us, the covenant, and you are the ones that are the other half of that arrangement, right? So it was a sign that a healing had been taking place, the sign of a consecration for an act of service, like the priests, and a sign of like a bonding, obedient relationship between God and man, or man to God, right? So Peter's speaking and taking deep cuts from the Old Testament right here. All right, verses 3 through 5. Blessed be the God of the Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, who according to his abundant mercy has begotten us again to a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead, to an inheritance incorruptible and undefiled, and that does not fade away, reserved in heaven for you, who are kept by the power of God through faith and for salvation, ready to be revealed in the last time. Okay, let's talk about all that. Christians are not people who were born, they are people who are made, right? You are reborn, you are remade, refashioned. Okay. So when we talk about like, are you a convert or are you cradle? No one's really cradle. We're all converts, every single one of us, right? Even if you were baptized as an infant, as a baby, you have converted this life to a new life, right? You have been converted from the life of the world to the life in heaven. So we're all converts, right? No one is born a Christian. We're all made Christians. And that requires a rebirth into a new life, okay? This rebirth to usher us into that new life is now founded on hope, this idea of hope. We are now like confident that God is going to give us something better in the life to come. We realize that our new birth is coming from an imperishable seed, right? We're going to see that at the closing lines of this chapter in verse 23. We have something of God himself inside us. The seed that has like formed our life is going to one day die. But if we get God's seed within us, that will never fade. It'll bloom for eternity, right? That's what we want. That's the seed that we want to cultivate and grow and nourish and water and prune and you know, like cultivate. I'm talking to a gardener about pruning right here. It's ridiculous. Who am I? Who am I? Who am I? Evgenia knows everything about God. I felt so out of my depth right there. This is made evident in the resurrection of Jesus Christ, right? We see that in verse 3. The Christian always has Christ beside us, right? Always. Whom or what can we fear if Christ is always with us? Not just any Christ, not just any Messiah, but the one who conquered death. Well, then whatever troubles are coming, we can handle it, right? So remember, you've been elect, you've been chosen by God for a specific purpose. That purpose is to be obedient. There are going to be some things that are going to test your obedience, but if you do that, you're going to gain this resurrection, this hope that's going to be manifested, that's going to be fulfilled in you. So just know there are going to be some tough times coming. Just be faithful, be obedient. God's here with you. All right. This rebirth is from our Father in heaven, which gives us a share of the inheritance of the kingdom to come. So you might hear this. Sosonotheos tonaonsu, ke evloison tin klironomiansu. Klironomiansu. That word is used here, klironomia, right? It was regularly used in the Old Testament a lot of times. The Greek translation of the Old Testament, obviously. Do you know when that word was used? It was used all the time. It's the inheritance. What did the Jews hope to inherit? The land of Canaan, the promised land. Yeah. Whenever the Old Testament authors, any of them, were talking about the promised land, this is the word they use. Isn't that cool? This is the word used for the promised land. Again, in the Greek translation, right? The land, like, I don't have it in front of me, but the land of klironomia, right? The land of inheritance, the land of promise, right? Now, this word typically suggested something that you could possess, like a land, you know, whatever. Though, if I channel my inner Pocahontas from like my kid years growing up with Disney, there's that one song of like, you can own the land, but you can own the dirt, but all you'll ever own is dirt, or something like that. Like whatever in that song, the colors of the wind, whatever, the thing that she's singing to John Smith. Yeah. I think it's such a beautiful line. Well, okay, so we can own land, I guess, ish, right? But what the Christian is talking about is that this is something better. This is even greater. This is not something that we're going to possess. This is going to be something that we like live in. Like it's going to be something that possesses us, right? We're going to become part of the body of God. That's awesome, right? Like I don't want a treasure that I can then hold and like wield. You know, I want a treasure that holds me, you know, encases me, you know. And so that's what's going to happen here for the Christians, right? Now, Unlike the promised land, this is masterful writing. So if it was Peter's inspiration or if this was Silas like wordsmithing things, this is beautiful. These three things, right? It says here, the inheritance, incorruptible, undefiled, and that does not fade away. Those three things. All right. Unlike the Jewish promised land, right? The Jewish inheritance, right? This kleronomia, right? This inheritance, this promised land doesn't do these three things. Aphthartos, right? Aphthartos is the first word, which is indestructible, right? Incorruptible. But it also means indestructible, right? Unravaged by invaders. This land will never be overcome, right? There's never going to be an army that is going to come and take your inheritance away from you. The Jews couldn't say the same about their promised land, their inheritance, all right? So that's the first one. This promised land will never be, what was the other one? Undefiled, right? Amiandos, right? Undefiled or without stain, right? Miano is stain, is like the negation, right? When you put an A in front of it, an alpha in front of it. So amiandos is without stain, right? So whereas the Jewish promised land was soiled by idolatry and all sorts of like not clean religions. They had Jewish blood, people with Jewish blood flowing in their veins that became Samaritans, that became, unclean worshipers, right? So they were still living in the promised land, but now it's become defiled with idolatry. Our inheritance become defiled like that, right? And then thirdly, amarandos, which means the unfading crown, or the does not fade away, amarandos, unfading, eternal spring, no decay. It's in spiritual bloom forever, right? The promised land that you're going to get, it's great. That's going to be fine. It's going to still have winter. It's still going to have scorching heat that we talked about in James, right? With that forest fire, that raging forest fires all the time, right? So all of the previous context for this word kleronomia in the Old Testament, okay, even when they got that thing that was promised to them, it still had these three things. It still could be conquered by invading armies. It could still be corrupted by pagan worship. It could still experience ebbs and flows and unseasonable weather and like fall and winter, right? And harsh suns where nothing grows. Your inheritance will never experience any of those things. It's better than the promised land. All right. It is because Christians possess and are possessed by God that they have found this inheritance, which is imperishable, undefilable, and can never fade away. All right. Verses 6 and 7. Boy, it's already 10 till. Gosh. All right. In this you will greatly rejoice, though now for a little while, if need be, you have been grieved by various trials. We're going to talk about that word. That the genuineness of your faith, being much more precious than gold that perishes, though it is tested by fire, may be found to praise, honor, and glory at the revelation of Jesus Christ, whom having not seen you love, though now you do not see him, yet believing you rejoice with joy inexpressible and full of glory. All right, let's pause there. All right, so here he's mentioning fire, right? This gold that's purified by the fire. It's very possible that he's writing this in response to the fires in Rome, right? So there's just it's possible, right? Even though this might have been the earlier letter that predated the fire in Rome, it's also possible that it wasn't, right? Or that those things came later. So just keep that in mind. All right. For Christians, persecution and tribulation are never the end, right? Beyond the troubles of this world lies a heavenly glory, and the hope in this can empower us to endure all things, right? Often people have to undergo painful surgeries or operations or rehabs for a course of like a treatment. We gladly accept the pain of that process because of the renewed health that's awaiting, right? We go through chemotherapy. Why? It's awful. Chemotherapy is terrible. Why? Because there's a better life beyond it, right? That hope, or the hope to share in that life with your children or your grandchildren, right? To make it to see your granddaughter's wedding, that's what strengthens us to go through all these hardships now. So keep that in mind, okay? Chrysostom said, that the righteous suffer so that they may be crowned with glory, but sinners suffer in order to bring judgment on their sins. Just like how not all righteous will suffer in this life, neither will all sinners suffer on earth. In all cases, ultimate glory or suffering await the resurrection. Okay? So, Christmas, I'm saying, not every bad person is going to get their comeuppance here. Not every good person is going to have to go through suffering, right? And not every good person is going to get the reward here. Your reward or your ultimate punishment is waiting after, right? After death. The Greek word here for variety of trials is actually really cool. Do you see that? The variety, right? By various trials in verse 6, by various trials. The Greek word there used is pikilos, right? Which means many colors, like lots of variety, lots of like almost like a rainbow, like many colors, right? This word is used only one other time in the New Testament, and it's in Peter. It's in this same letter. It's in chapter 4. He uses pikilos, right, to describe the various types of troubles and trials that we'll have. He also uses it to describe the, quote, manifold grace of God. How cool is that? That there is no variety, there's no color that we'll face in human life that God can't match. Isn't that amazing? We won't have a shade that he's like, I don't have that. We have to destroy this whole thing. I can't paint that, you know? He can match anything that we see. His grace has the perfect measurement to match whatever the thing is that we're going through. There is nothing that we can do. There's no spectrum that he can't touch us on, you know? I think that's beautiful. And I think those words were clearly meant, they were intentionally used, right? So even though it'll say various and it'll say manifold, that's the same word in Greek. Pikilos, all right? This is from St. Athanasius the Great. He says, because saints saw that the divine fire would cleanse them and benefit them, they did not shrink back from or get discouraged by the trials that they faced. Rather than being hurt by what they went through, they grew and were made better, shining like gold that had been refined in fire, right? So again, the resilience of the Christian believer. All right, we've got time. We can do it. We can do it. Let's go. We have to do it. We don't have the luxury of just cruising through, just loafing through the book here. All right, here we go. Verse 9. Receiving the end of your faith, the salvation of your souls. That's the end of we should have read that last time. Sorry. Of this salvation, the prophets have inquired and searched carefully, who prophesied of the grace that would come to you, searching what manner of time the Spirit of Christ, who was in them, was indicating when he testified beforehand the sufferings of Christ and glories that would follow. All right. Let's see. Yeah, we're going to read. Yeah, we'll finish the thought. To them, it was revealed that not to themselves, but to us, they were ministering the things which now have been reported to you through those who have preached the gospel to you by the Holy Spirit sent from heaven, things which angels desire to look into. All right. My apologies for reading that in a very rough kind of like tongue-tied way. We are told two things about the prophets. So he's talking about all of these things that were preached to you. All the things that we are preaching to you now have been prophesied. Like this is not something new. It might be new to you because you're not Jews who had the prophets, right? But all these things had been testified for millennia, for thousands of years, right? So trust me, even though you don't have this library, this resource to like fall back on, be like, oh yeah, you know what? Isaiah did say that, right? The people he's talking to don't have that bank account, right? So he's saying, trust me, there are people who prophesied about all of these things. This is verified, okay? All right. We're told two things about prophets in this section here. They searched and asked for the coming of salvation. Like, when's it happening? What's going to happen? When is this Christ coming? Who is this Christ? In what way will he save us? They searched these things. They asked for these things. And the second part is that the Spirit told them about the Christ who would bring it, right? So they asked about salvation. They asked about, where are we going to be redeemed finally? Where are we going to be saved? Who is this Christ? And then the Holy Spirit responded by saying, okay, I'm not going to tell you anything about that, but I'm going to tell you about who's going to bring it to you, right? So having said that, that means that there's a divine and human component to prophecies, right? There is the human quest for knowledge and understanding, and then also the godly revelation, okay? Right. In all prophecies, these holy spokesmen of God were delivering the glorious message for who? For them, so they would be famous, or for their own notoriety or their own following or their own? No. For clicks and likes? No. They were delivering these prophecies for the people's benefit. The people, even if it was something that was not comfortable, right? Even when John the Baptist is talking to Herod saying, like, you are not doing well marrying, your brother's Philip's wife. That's no good. Like, it's still for their benefit so that he can repent and be saved, All right. So this is the thing that the prophets did to try and fight this unbelief, to try and build up a sense of faith and like adherence to the faith. This was by St. Cyril of Alexandria. Okay. St. Cyril of Alexandria said, unbelief, lack of faith, is the most horrible and wicked thing on earth. It is the most horrible and wicked thing on earth. But faith is the highest good, for it is the harbinger, the bringer of our entire salvation. If you have faith, that's going to be the thing that makes all of this salvation possible. That's what the prophets were working for. Like, if you have that, even if I am Daniel and I'm prophesying during a time of captivity in Babylon, gosh, if we have this faith, it doesn't matter if we're in Babylon or if we're in Assyria, or if we're in Egypt, we are in the promised land. A promised land because the promised land itself can do all of these three things that are no good, right? The promised land that we're looking for is the one in heaven. Okay, so the prophets were always trying to minister and speak for the benefit of the people listening to them, all right? This is combined with the fact that many times, maybe most of the times, the prophet who was speaking never actually got to see the thing he was prophesying about, right? Think about Moses. When God took him to Pisgah, right? And showed him the promised land and said, good, you're not going to go in there. You can't go in there. Everyone else will. You can't. Well, all of the previous generation had to die, and then the new generation, the ones born in Exodus, the ones born in the wandering could go in, but the ones that came from Egypt couldn't go in, right? So again, that's Deuteronomy chapter 34, verse 4. Or think about Beethoven, right? He wasn't deaf always, but he went deaf, and he still continued to compose. Well, he never even was able to hear the thing that he wrote, So that shows that these prophets weren't for their own gain ever. They were trying to work for the benefit of the people that were there, Saint Irenaeus talked about this. There is one son who accomplished the Father's will for the entire human race. Even Christ didn't do any of the things that he did for his own. He didn't want books written about him. I mean, like, yeah, he did so that others could be saved, but not because he wanted to be on the cover of, the best-selling book, right? He did it for our salvation. St. Irenaeus says, there is one son who accomplished the Father's will for the sake of the entire human race, in which the mysteries of God are accomplished, which the angels long to behold. That's such an awesome idea. These angels that are next to God in heaven wish they could be us. Isn't that crazy? Because the angels are up there and they don't know what it's like to be saved. They don't know what it's like to be redeemed. They're just the ones who have always been there, right? It's kind of crazy, but it's like the prodigal son. They're the older brother that never left the house. Like, you're throwing a party for them? I wish I was the younger brother. That's irrational. That's crazy, but they do. It's not in a jealous way. It's not in a jealous way like the older brother was. The older brother took it too far, but the angels still look at us longingly. Like, gosh, God created me. He created you too, but he died for you. He didn't die for me. It's amazing. He loves you that much. That's something, right? He loves the angels that much too. The angels didn't need right? All right, let's go on. Let's read the rest of it and then just talk about it as a whole, since we're a little over time. We're at time right now. All right, so let's read the rest of it. Therefore, gird up the loins of your mind. That's always makes me smile. We had a professor at Holy Cross, one of the sweetest priests ever, and he still is, and he's still around. And one of my friends was in the front seat of the class, and he fell asleep during class. And I won't tell you his name, but Father saw him sleeping, but he's just so gentle. He's just so he like never would get ever. He'd never raise his voice ever, and so like he tried to like gently wake him up, and he wasn't waking. He wasn't waking. So he shook him a little bit. He shook him a little bit. He didn't wake up, and so finally he popped him like a little bit. He like popped him, and he like woke up with like a startle. And I won't say his name. We'll say his name is Yanni. Like we'll say his name is Yanni. He was like, Yanni, gird yourself. It was like you're sleeping during class. Like gird yourself. I'll never ever forget that. We still whenever we see him, we're like, gird yourself. It's silly. So whenever I see that, I always laugh. Think about my friend. His name is not Yanni. All right. Therefore, gird up the loins of your mind. Be sober and rest your hope fully upon the grace that is to be brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. As obedient children, not conforming yourselves to the former lusts as in your ignorance, right? So this is clearly a Gentile population he's talking to. Jews don't have that, right? But as he who called you is holy, you also be holy in all your conduct, because it is written, be holy, for I am holy. And if you call on the Father, who, without partiality, judges according to each one's work, conduct yourselves throughout the time of your stay here in fear, knowing that you were not redeemed with corruptible things, like silver or gold, from your aimless conduct received by tradition from your fathers, but with the precious blood of Christ as of a lamb without blemish and without spot. He indeed was foreordained before the foundation of the world, but was manifest in these last times for you, who through him believe in God, who raised him from the dead and gave him glory, so that your faith and hope are in God. All right, there's a lot there. We're going to unpack it all right now. All right. We must spiritually gird ourselves, like he starts with in verse 13. In the Middle East at that time, men wore long robes, and they wore one broad belt, like a cloth belt that was across their midsection, like a girdle, right? When they had to work strenuously or when action was needed, they would pull up their long robe or tuck it up and into the girdle, right? So they'd pull it up so that it would kind of like fall over the belt a little bit so that they could move freely. They could run or they could do whatever. They could pull in the fishing net or whatever the thing was, right? Or Peter would just take the whole thing off because he was stripped for work, right? So the idea of girding yourself is the same thing as like taking off your jacket and rolling up your sleeves. Right? All right. What he's saying here is we cannot, as Christians, fail in our necessary work of loving God and loving our neighbor because of our surroundings or because of what we're wearing or our furnishings or the extras of our life. The things that are on us or around us or that are clothing us or veiling us in our life can't be the thing that's the impediment for us getting our work done. We have to be able to take that off. We have to gird our minds, right? Like he's saying, we have to gird our souls, right? And be sober-minded. This quote, excuse me, here. This quote is from St. Theophylact. He said, to be conformed, listen to this, because he says it here. He says it here, do not conform yourself, right? In verse 14. To be conformed to the things of this world means to be surrounded by them, be clothed in them. Even today, there are some weak-willed people who say that when they are in Rome, they have to behave as the Romans do. How funny is that? When in Rome, We just read somebody from 1700 years ago, 1800 years ago that's saying when in Rome. How funny is that, right? There are some weak-willed people who say when they are in Rome, they have to behave as the Romans do. But whether they do this knowingly or in ignorance, the message here is clear. We are to abandon this world and be only conformed to the one who alone is truly holy. Saint Theophylact, way to go. I love that. I love that's that. That first paragraph was brought to you by Theophylact. Okay. Christ is the Redeemer and the Lord. He is the great deliverer and the spotless lamb, like we hear in verse 19, that saves us from the bondage of sin and death. This harkens back to Isaiah chapter 53 with the suffering servant, right? Through whose sufferings we are healed. This also is the Passover lamb. No disturb. Sorry. Everyone tell Kay that I was doing Bible study. I'm sorry about that. This also harkens back to the Passover lamb from Exodus chapter 12, right? The sprinkling of blood on the lintel and the doorposts to the angel of death the angel of the Lord would pass over and not take the son. Chrysostom says, think of a righteous householder. Think of a righteous householder who does not regard a wicked servant as worthy to serve in his house, right? A righteous and good householder that sees a servant say, you know what, we need to have a change here. I'm gonna let you go, right? I'm gonna fire you. He hands the servant over to another master who will correct him and discipline him. After a while, that householder sees his servant being punished harshly by his new master. Moved by compassion, he goes then to the master and buys back his former servant, that he might gain back his honor and be redeemed as a productive and faithful servant once more. That's what Christ has done, right? This salvific work was part of the eternal plan. It was not a backup plan, right? He says it here. He indeed, in verse 20, he indeed was foreordained before the foundation of the world, right? For what? To be the lamb without blemish. He was foreordained to be the lamb without blemish before the foundation of the world, all right? This was not a backup plan after the fall from Eden. Christ's role as Redeemer was valid and in place even before his role as Creator. Isn't that crazy? That's amazing. He was ready. He was ready to save creation before he made creation. Even so, when thinking of Christ, we should never separate the resurrection from the cross, right? We can never look at his cross without thinking about his victory over death, nor should we separate the cross or the resurrection from his birth, right? This idea of like, oh, well, he was born. It's just Christmas. No, we think about that. This was step one of that plan for salvation. Like this baby is born to be our spotless lamb, to die for us, you know? That's changes a little bit of what you think on Christmas, right? Like it makes you more grateful. Yeah. Right. Before he created everything else, he was ready to take on this plan for us. This wasn't the backup plan. He didn't have to necessarily die on the cross. He could have lived with us, gone to an old age and died with us, and then saved us from death. But he just had to perfect the law, right? That's all he had to do. He had to perfect the first covenant so that he could give us the second covenant, right? So he had to perfect the Mosaic law and then defeat death by death. And then now we're back into paradise, right? So basically we ate from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. He had to perfect the weighing of good and evil so that we could get back to the Garden of Eden, right? And so we could get back to paradise. So he didn't have to die on the cross. He didn't have to die on the cross, but he had to live on earth. He had to die and then go back. He could have fallen asleep in peace, at 100 years old, and that'd been how much better would the world be? Golly, if he had 100 years of ministering instead, or 70 years instead of 3. Jeez. Yeah, we're probably not talking about fires and pitchforks, right? Probably talking about like a great, like everyone's like, yeah, maybe your kingdom came, right? At this point, like maybe it's like, oh, okay, good, they're ready. I'll be right back. Let me die. No, I'm gonna come right back. But yeah, so his role as our Redeemer was in place before he even created us. It's pretty amazing. That, according to Peter, right? All right. The godless life. These are the last two things. The godless life versus the Christian life. Both of them have three characteristics. Let's talk about each of them pretty quickly, and let's go on. All right, and we'll close for the day. The godless life has three characteristics. It's ignorant, verse 14, right? It's ignorant. Plato once said to try and find the framer and father of the universe is futile. Even if one did find him, it would be impossible to express him in terms that anyone could understand. The ancient Gentiles saw no hope in knowing God, so they stopped trying to live morally. They just didn't care. What's the point, right? They would say that if we're going to die like dogs, we might as well live like dogs. They just did not care, right? But ignorance is no excuse, okay? So ignorance. The godless life is also dominated by desire, right? You see that in verse 14 as well. The affluent were lost in their luxury, just lost in it. They were just so decadent that it eroded their core, right? We talked about that last week, right? It totally eroded their character. Emperor Vitellius, Roman Emperor Vitellius, would often throw extravagant balls, extravagant ones, like sometimes multiple nights a week, many nights a week. It is reported that at these dinner dances, at these balls, there would be over 2,000 fish and 7,000 birds served at a single dinner. It's crazy, right? The worst part wasn't even the excess. You're not going to like this. This is like Temple of Doom stuff from Indiana Jones. It was also the depravity. They would feast, quote, on the brains of peacocks and the nightingale's tongues. So they were taking the beautiful thing about a nightingale and eating it because of the rush, saying like, this bird will never sing again, you know? Like it's not eating like the wing or like the meat. It's finding like the humiliating thing to eat, right? Like that's disgusting. That's disgusting, right? They were completely lost in it, right? The chastity had been completely forgotten. Saint Jerome, giving a homily one time, said that there was a woman who was marrying her 23rd husband and that she was his 21st wife, right? Imagine that. Imagine that, right? How crazy is that? Promiscuity was rampant in ancient Greece and Rome. And it was a world just ruled by desire, whose only aim was to find more extreme ways to feed that desire, right? What's the new way I can please myself? It was just disgusting, right? So the godless world was one that was ignorant, but also just corrupted by desires, right? And then thirdly, it was one that was futile, right? It was just marred by futility. The Roman poet Catullus once wrote, "Suns can rise and set again, but once our brief light is dead, there's nothing left but one long night from which we'll never shall awake," right? They didn't see the point of life anymore. So they're just going to feed their passions, right? All of these play together, right? We'll never know God. All we have is now. So let's just eat it up and live it up, right? That's what Gentiles did in the ancient church. And this is what Peter's trying to talk to them about. Be like, hey, come on, right? Let's get it together a little bit. This was a really impressive quote by St. Ambrose of Milan, who said, "You have been given time on earth, not eternity. You've only been given this time on earth, not eternity. Use the time as those who know that they're setting out from here on a long voyage." If you've ever hosted somebody, and we're about to host my parents and my sister for Halloween because it's fun, and my parents have never done trick or treating with the kids, and it goes crazy here. My neighborhood gets crazy, so it's like something to see. Whatever. We're not making a stance on if Halloween's good or not, but they're going to see the festivities, right? My kids ask me like, "Why don't we decorate for Halloween? Why is our house got nothing on it? We've got like wagons and wheelbarrows and stuff like, right? We have like the yay fall, thing, They're like, "Why don't we do it?" I'm like, because it's gross. I don't want to have like a dead corpse in my yard. Anyway, if you've ever hosted somebody at your house and when they're like getting ready to leave, like it almost like upsets you how ready to leave they are, where they're just thinking about like when their flight is, or, "Oh no, we can't go to dinner because I've got to pack, like they put off the invitations that you have because the only thing they can think of, especially if they're flying, the only thing they can think of is making sure that they don't miss that flight, right? That's what Ambrose is saying. Prepare like someone who is like view life as someone who is preparing for a long journey. Like it's imminently coming. I've got to pack, I've got to like rush with urgency to my gate to make sure that I got to be there 2 hours early, right? Think about that. That'll be a sermon one day. Act surprised when you hear it on Sunday. One of these days. It might not be this one. All right. So those are the three things, right? Ignorance, dominated by desires, and marred by futility. All right. That's the godless life. Let's look at the Christian life on the contrast. It is obedient and holy, right? Verses 14 through 16. It's obedient and holy. To be chosen by God is not only a great honor, but it's a great responsibility. Holy is agios, which means not of this world. It means set apart, right? The Sabbath was holy because it was different than other days, right? The temple was holy because it's different than other buildings. The Christian is holy because it's different from all of that like immoral riffraff, right? It's not like the fallen man or the fallen woman. It's a transfigured person who is beautiful because he looks like the creator. It's amazing. And loves those who are, like still marred by that ugliness of sin. He still loves the sinner and like helps the sinner and helps his enemy. That's beautiful. All right. So the Christian is obedient and holy, right? Number two, the Christian is reverent. That means that they're always in the perspective that they are always in the presence of God. They never lose sight of that. And then the third one, right? The third one is that they always have mutual love. They're full of it, right? This stems from Christ. Knowing how much Christ loved us, we can't help but show that love to each other. St. Ambrose said this: you owe that price which you have been bought, right? You owe him that price for which you have been bought. Even though God doesn't always demand it, you still owe it. Buy Christ for yourself, not with treasures that only a few rich men may possess, but with what all men possess by nature, but only a few are brave enough to offer your life. Ambrose, what, like back-to-back quotes right there. Amazing, right? Offer not which only a few rich men can possess, like gold or whatever the thing may be. Offer what all men possess, but only few are brave enough to offer their life. That's what a Christian does. They are full of that love that they can't help but offer their life back to God and to each other that they see. Okay? That's chapter 1, and that is intro to the letters of St. Peter. God bless. All right. Through the prayers of the Father's Lord Jesus Christ, your God, have mercy on us and save us. Amen. End.